It is so good to welcome you here to Stones Hill Community Church this morning. I believe it's Steve Weaver I see here on the second row. Steve, it's great to have you back. I know it's been a tough journey. And it's been a tough journey for many of us this week. It just seems like it's been very difficult to maintain focus. And so I really appreciate the Ammunition Band being here on today, a day like today, because it's been very difficult for a lot of us. So let's continue to pray for the Denise Fry family. I know they would appreciate our prayers, and they've got a lot of processing yet to do this week with viewing and funeral, and we prayed for the Fry family this past week, and we'll continue to do that, trusting the Lord to give guidance in all of this. Sometimes when things like this happen, we ask why. And someone said that that little three-letter question, why, with the question mark on the end, is kind of like a fish hook. We turn it upside down and we ram it up in the human heart. And that's how grief is sometimes. We ask why, and it's okay to ask why as we try to process through these kinds of times. And it's so important for us to take our why questions to God. And sometimes as well, I think when we ask the why question and we wonder why life is set up the way it is, and we wrestle with it, sometimes I think it's important for us to, in Psalms of Lament, we see this, for example, to voice our complaints to God, to take our complaints to Him. And so it's okay to complain to God, though. And that's the psalmist's approach. And so that's what I would encourage all of us to do, is to take our hurt and our grief to the Lord during this time. I don't like to frame the issue this way, but sometimes I will hear people say, what kind of game is God playing with us little peon humans down here, right? And sometimes, I talk to a lot of different people or communicate with them in various ways. And sometimes it's presented as a game, some kind of cosmic game. And I don't like that terminology, but if you're going to set it up that way, then what we have to say is God played by His own rules. He played by His own rules. And we've talked about this, how in Philippians we've talked about the incarnational demeanor of Jesus. We've talked about Jesus becoming flesh, becoming man, not just any man, but a humble servant kind of man. He died a death, not just any death, but He was executed via Roman stake. And so we see this lowering of Himself, and the crown of thorns hurt. The spikes hurt. It hurt. So if you want to frame the issue that way, and I don't like it, but if you're going to frame it that way, what we have to say is that God immersed Himself in our suffering. It hurt Him, and He endured and walked through the kinds of valleys of the shadow of death that we also have to walk through sometimes. So God has immersed Himself in Jesus, through Jesus, in our sufferings. And we can take hope and respite and strength from that. So I'm Pastor Joey, and it's great to welcome you here. If you're here for the first time, welcome. It's a delight to have you here. And as already been mentioned, we've had a guest band with us this morning. And like I said, I appreciate the timing of this band being here on a day like today. And so what I would like to do, and this kind of just occurred to me a few moments ago, I know they've sung to us and they've shared with us in song, but when special messengers come through like this, in times like these, I would just like to extend to the group an invitation. You've ministered to us in song, but perhaps you would like to offer an exhortation or a word of encouragement. And so I would just like to front load this message time today with that opportunity. What might you share with us? And I've got a mic. If you want to come up, okay, great, awesome. Just tell us who you are and share with us. Yep.
Well, thank you. My name is Josh Swinson. I am a youth pastor in Knoxville, Tennessee. And I met Dave about 3 years ago. And him and the Ammunition Band have come to our church and our events several times. And just have the opportunity to come and speak this week with him at the youth lock-in. I see some of those guys here today. But what I would want to do is I would want to tell you that God can use each and every one of us in a mighty way. My journey has been long, and we don't have enough time for today to go into that. Some of the youth got to hear my story the other night, and I got to share that with them. But I know that in times of trial, God shows His strength, and God is faithful.
Good.
I will share one story with you real quick. Just about a month ago, my wife had some serious pains. I thought her appendix was about to burst, and so what we did is I rushed her to the emergency room. We found out she was pregnant and having a miscarriage. And it was tough. It was hard. And I know some of you out there have gone through that experience. But through that experience, God just comforted me and said, everything's going to be okay. Everything's going to be okay. And it was. It was okay. God was in control of my life. God is in control of each and every one of our lives. He has a hand on every single one of us. And I'm so thankful for that. I'm so thankful for the love of Jesus Christ, that He came and He died for me.
Yes.
And He loves me that much.
Yes.
And so I don't know what anybody's going through. Obviously, you guys have lost a loved one.
Yes, we have.
Jesus loves you. He has a plan for each and every one of you. Okay? Take strength in that. Go to the cross. Trust in Jesus. Thank you all.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you. That's awesome. And essentially, I can really say it no better today, is trust in Jesus. He's our hope. He's our strength, and it's wonderful to walk with the Lord. And a lot of times we struggle with issues like anybody else, and we struggle with those issues as Christ followers, and it's sometimes very tough. But He is our strength and our hope. And we've been talking in this series about renewing the mind. And sometimes we have to have our minds renewed as we walk through these kinds of issues and as we experience life. So the series we've been working on is out of the book of Philippians. And I want to encourage you to continue working through this book with me to kind of orient you to the book. And perhaps we'll have the words up on the screen just a second. But to orient you to some of the themes of this book and kind of the overall movement of the book, it's ironically about joy. Can we have joy? Can we have a renewed mind? Can we have a source of strength? Can we tap into a resource of strength so great, so substantial, that it holds us steady when we go through times like these, whether it's miscarriage or the loss of someone we love, or maybe there's other losses in your life? Can there be joy? I know our emotions do this sometimes, and that's normal. But can there be a sense of joy, of strength, a quiet strength? And I think that's what Paul is advocating that we can have. And so he begins to dictate this letter. More than likely, he writes this letter through the pen of Epaphroditus, and he tells Epaphroditus, this is what I want to say in reply to the Philippians, who have graciously given me a gift while I'm incarcerated here in Rome. And he was under arrest in Rome, a city called Rome. Paul is a great spokesman for the Christian faith, and he's been able to do a lot of things. And one of the things he's trying to do is disciple his baby Christians from a distance, several hundred miles away. They've heard that he's in jail, he's in prison, he may not make it. And so we've been working our way through the first couple of chapters of Philippians. And ironically enough, this book is one of Paul's prison epistles, and yet the main theme of it is joy. And I would ask you this morning, do you have joy? A sustaining, substantial strength to bring you through these tough moments. And what has been already shared with you in exhortation this morning, essentially Christ is Paul's source of joy. And so I would encourage you to open up your life to Him. And as you open up your life to Him, I think what you're going to find is that the Christian life gets very, very practical. And there's some practical things that you and I can do to enhance joy in our hearts and our lives. And so what he does is he gives to us, and I've shared this with you through the Christmas season and things, he gives to us some powerful examples of how we can have our mind renewed and how we need to begin to start thinking like Jesus, for example, Paul himself, Timothy, Epaphroditus, and he lays out these examples in chapter 2 of here's some models for us to emulate. And of course, the very first model or example he gives us to emulate is the incarnational example of Jesus. And I've shared with you before, Paul places before the divided Philippian community. They were having some unity issues, they were going through some joyless things, and they were struggling with this. Some losses in their life, some division in their body. And Paul places before them the incarnational example of Jesus and says, if all of us will adopt the mindset of Christ, you will resolve probably 99% of the issues that you have, relational issues that you have. And that's what Philippians 2 verses 5 through 11 is about. Paul could not be with them. He's like, I hear these relational issues. I'm struggling to know what to do about them. But let me write this letter, and I'll dictate it to Epaphroditus. He'll write it down. He'll deliver it. He'll read it to you when you gather together. And you guys will find out I'm actually okay and I'm still alive, and I may get out of this, but then again I may not. And if I live as Christ, to die is gain. Philippians 1:21, we talked about this. Okay? But if I don't make it, here's what I want you to do. I cannot possibly be there right now. I cannot possibly resolve every minute detail of your relational lives and the issues and the conflicts you may have. But I'm going to give you a one-stop principle, and I talked to you about that last week. A one-stop principle for resolving the relational issues in your life. Adopt the mindset of Christ. The incarnational demeanor of Jesus. Wear it, live it, think it. Let it flesh itself out in how we do marriage, boyfriend-girlfriend relationships, how we do teams and teams that we're on, whether it's a sports team or a work team, how we think about life, to bring into our thinking this renewed mindset of Jesus. And so now, that's kind of the context, guys. Now, what's he say practically next in this way of thinking? What does he do? Well, he says to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And we talked a little bit about that, how that salvation in Philippians 2, verse 12 on the screen, how that he calls them dear friends, and he says, hey, listen, I'm not able to be with you, but I want you to obey as if I were. And sometimes it's easier not to do something someone asks us to do if they're not actually asking us face to face. So he realizes that. But he says, now listen, guys, I want you to continue to work out, not work for, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. In other words, I want you to work out what God has worked in verse 13. It is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill His good purpose. And so we're not working for anything. God has worked in us in an incredible way through Christ. And now He's asking us, through Paul, to work out that which God has worked within. So we're not working for, we're working out in a practical way. The Christ-centered worldview, the mindset of Christ, we want to work that out in our life with fear and trembling. Okay? Now, verse 14, 12 and 13 we kind of dealt with last week. Verse 14, Paul picks up with a practical exhortation. And this is what he says. If you want to increase joy in your life, if you want to resolve this major conflict that has surfaced in the Philippian community in my absence, and we can say by application here, if you want to resolve issues, relational issues in your life, if you want to head into 2015 with a new approach, a new mindset, a mind that is renewed and ready to engage your relational world. If you've got these kind of fringe edges, these untied edges, or these tattered edges from relationships in 2014, unresolved issues that are still tethered, they're still kind of connected, but they're not really, you're not sure what the purpose of all of it is or was. If you want to start brand new, this is a great opportunity to begin to think that way right now, today. And in fact, if I were to, and we'll get to this practical exhortation in just a second, verse 14, but if I were to somehow stand back from this message, and I often do this, like, what would I hope to accomplish with this message today? And that I'm issuing a plea for some revolutionaries. That's what I'm doing. And that's where we're going to end up today. A plea for some revolutionaries. And it's crazy, but oftentimes the revolutionary power of a new idea, and Paul championed this, the revolutionary power of a new idea is often squelched by little practical nitpicking things like grumbling or arguing. Do you know that? It is. We have this great revolutionary idea. Paul championed it. The Philippians were buying in. It was revolutionizing their community. It was taking the world by storm. Paul was going to give this great revolutionary new idea that He's hanging on to the world in Jesus. He's clinging to it. He's seeking to redeem it. He refuses to let it go. You have been saved, past tense. Remember last week? You are being saved presently. There's a lot of stuff in your life you're not going to experience because you've chosen to be a Christ follower. And that's all good. Not always good, though. I mean, there's some bad situations we face, but we've got Christ in the center of our worldview, right? And He walks with us through those. You are going to be saved. The 3 tenses of salvation, we talked about this. Okay? And Paul references this even in this paragraph, how the coming of Christ, He's going to come and you'll be ready and all things will be revealed and you'll be ready. But what he's asking them to do is, guys, I'm leading a revolution. Yeah, I'm incarcerated, but it's you that's going to pick up the baton. You're going to run with this idea. This great message that God has saved the world through Jesus. You've been saved. You've been rescued. There's a new life, a new beginning, and not one of you has been accepted in regard to God's plan. You're all included, right? And now he says there's something that can taint the message. And who wants to hear this great message if we're doing verse 14 all of the time? If we're a grumbling, arguing group. It dims the light. And he says it. And I love how practical Paul is. And maybe it's a good time for us to ask the question, do I grumble? Am I grumbling too much? Am I arguing too much? You see, it's not so much that we don't grumble, we do. I found myself grumbling over the holidays. Grumbling. I don't know really over what. Just you get in a bad mood sometimes, and you have to say goodbye, and then you're kind of wearing that emotional edge on your sleeve, and you're kind of sad about that, and then you go through tough times, and there's maybe unresolved issues, and you find yourself just kind of grumbling, and maybe more apt to argue. And this divides families. It hurts teams. It divides bodies of Christ, organizations far and wide. This idea, I'm gonna grumble or murmur, and then that's going to break out into, it's contagious. That'll break out into arguing, and one thing leads to another, and we get sloppy with our words. Bam! We've got a relational conflict, and we're like this. And Paul says that will, if we don't watch ourselves, that will taint the great revolutionary idea that we've got that is transforming the world. Come on, Philippians. I love you. I pray for you. As often as I think of you, I pray for you. Philippians 1, first paragraph, right? But this little relational thing that's kind of come to a head in your body, I want you to address it. And it's not so much that we don't have conflict as Christ's followers. It's what we do with it. that sets the body of Christ apart. And so I would just put before this congregation this exhortation, that is that one of the greatest gifts you can give a community is to be a body of Christ that resolves conflict well. Don't do what everybody else does with conflict. Resolve it well and come together and work through it, as Paul says and encourages for us to do. So he says to these revolutionaries, these kingdom creative kingdom life changers, he says, do everything without grumbling or arguing. And if you look into the word grumbling, it's a translation of a Greek word which means to mutter, to murmur. It was used of the cooing of doves, or something like that. I don't know. That's not how I'm going to earn my living. But anyway, a cooing of a dove. You picture that, all right? The cooing of a dove. Kind of under your breath. Just kind of under the radar. It's not stuff spoken out loud. It's internal stuff that's getting thought and processed, and that sometimes just kind of it kind of tumbles and mumbles and slips out of our lips, but not real articulated. It's just kind of there. Right? And the word is what your literary critics call onomatopoetic. What's that mean? Okay, when you say the word in Greek, gongusma, it means what it sounds like when you say it. And that's the word Paul uses. Gongusma. Have you done that this holiday season? Have you ever done that? Gongusma. You're just kind of muttering, talking to yourself. Paul says, hey, watch the self-talk, revolutionaries. We've got a world to change. And the light's going to get dim if we don't get a grip on this conflict stuff and begin resolve it in a way that honors Christ. And so he says, and he uses this unique word, gongusman. He uses it only one time in his letter, and you got it. It's used right here in the book of Philippians, the book of joy. And this word is actually used in a Greek translation of the Old Testament, and Paul would have had the Septuagint. The Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. It happened about 200 BC. Paul and other New Testament writers quote frequently from the Septuagint, or the Greek version of the Hebrew Old Testament. And this word is used several times in the Septuagint. And every time that it's used, guess what? Guess what it describes? It describes Israel's desert wanderings. It's used in a context where they have chosen to follow other idols. They have chosen to complain against Moses. This is how this word is used. And so more than likely, Paul has this in mind when he used the term in 61 AD to a group of young believers called Philippians who were grasping at joy, trying to figure out how to resolve conflict, how to live up to this big idea of being a world revolutionary. Paul says, I want you to watch this, and I don't want you to align yourself with a generation that has pursued this kind of track. So he says, gongusma, from the Septuagint, always used in a complaining, idolatrous context. Be careful, he's saying to this group of young believers. You know, this point about grumbling and complaining reminds me of one of my favorite stories. A monk entered a monastery in which he agreed to take a vow of silence. And he can only speak 2 words every year. After the first year, he was brought before the leader, and this rookie monk said, bed hard. And that's all he said. That was his 2 words for the year. The next year comes up, and this monk says to his leader, food bad. That was his 2 words for the year. Bed hard, food bad. Well, the 3rd year comes up, vow of silence, 2 words a year. And he goes before his leader. And his leader, he's waiting for these 2 words quota for the year. And this 3-year term monk said, I quit. And the leader of the monastery said, well, it doesn't surprise me. You haven't done anything but complain since you got here. This is expected, right? Okay. Listen, guys, there's a place for working through issues that we kind of mutter to ourselves. We don't have to ignore those. We don't have to pretend like they're not there. But when it comes to a Christ-following life, it's so important that we look at these issues in our lives and we purpose to resolve them in a way that lifts up Jesus. Now, this is kind of an indicator of what is yet to come in this book. Let me take you to Philippians chapter 4, verses 2 and 3. It's slide 5, guys. Slide 5. And what we've got two ladies who are at odds. And so Paul kind of gives an indicator, or he hints at the issue in this second chapter. But he actually faces it head on in chapter 4. And so he wants to get this said, but he's not sure how to do it. And eventually he gets to the place where he's just going to call them by name. And so he says, I plead with Euodia and I plead with Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. You see, if this letter was going to be read aloud, there is great significance in Paul mentioning them both by name. And I want you to notice that the word plead appears before each of their names. I plead with Euodia. I plead with Syntyche. He says it twice. Even in the very grammatical structure of how he says this, he's trying to show even-handedness and equality. He's not going to choose sides between Euodia and Syntyche. He says, I plead with Euodia, I plead with Syntyche, the same amount of words, the same terms used. He's going to be very even-handed. He doesn't demand apologies. He doesn't desire or declare that one is wrong and one is right. He just says, listen, I want you to get together. I want you to get the mind of the Lord on it and figure out how you can lift up the Lord in light of the conflict situation that's surfaced between you two ladies. And that's what he says. He says, yes, and I ask you, my true companion. He looks and he turns and he looks at Epaphroditus. And he says, listen, Epaphroditus, you help these women. And the reason is that they are revolutionaries too. They have worked side by side with me, and they are great teammates, and they have contended at my side, verse 3, in the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers, whose names we'll never read about them in the newspapers, unfortunately, but their names are written in the book of life. Wow. So these two influential ladies have an issue. And so presence of conflict is not a problem. We have it all the time in the Bible. So if you're in a conflict situation as you begin a new year, don't fret or fear. It's perfectly normal to have conflict in your life. What distinguishes a kingdom revolutionary from just a garden variety, ordinary person in the world who has no idea what biblical worldview they're living, or what worldview they're living by? What distinguishes between you and everybody else as a Christ follower is that you come at this thing called conflict in a way that you're endeavoring to lift up Jesus through it. That's the distinguishing factor. And so we don't know precisely the issue. It could have been racially based. There were lots of different races in Philippi. As we study the city in 61 AD, it could have been ethnic based, some cultural background issue. It could have been personality based, and we've seen those situations where personalities clash. It could have been social based, social class based. They were very class conscious in Philippi. It might have even been a doctrine based thing where maybe some lesser theological, minor theological issue. Paul didn't really want to address it, but maybe it was some minor point of theology, and they had decided to take up positions on this, and it really come between them and threatened to divide the unified body of the Philippians. And so Paul, again, he sets before them, again I say, the incarnational example of Jesus, and now he gets practical. He says basically, stop arguing, stop complaining, stop grumbling, let's get past it, let's focus on a common revolutionary goal, let's change the world. And you ladies work through this. And Epaphroditus, you set it up and be the intermediary if necessary, but this is how important I think this is for us to get past this relational issue. And I think it's interesting. Euodia's name means sweet scent. And Syntyche's name means fortunate or good luck or happy chance. And I think Paul raises an eyebrow when he says those two names. And he's in hoping that those two ladies will live up to their name. To bring good fortune. To bring a sweet scent, a sweet aroma to this revolutionary body of believers in the city of Philippi. Now listen, if we look at this and we place it in context, we have to say that Paul realizes that their minds maybe are focused more on the pettiness of an argument than the revolutionary idea of what it means to be a shining example in the world of this great message that God has entrusted to us through Jesus. And so he realizes this, and he's saying, guys, I want your joy to be great. I want your mind to be renewed. I want you to be in a position to continue to change the world, but let's learn to work out the little petty things in light of the bigger things of what Christ is doing in the world. Okay, now listen, I'm a practical guy. I realize that conflict is a very real part of our life, and I realize that maybe there are some practical ways that we can think about this. And Paul certainly acknowledges the conflict. He wants the ladies to approach each other. He wants them to aim at reconciliation. It's not always possible. He wants them to forgive each other. He wants them to lift up Jesus. He wants them to find common ground. And if we look on slide 9, I think there's some practical things I've kind of charted out here. Slide 9, maybe this will help you as you begin to think about the conflicts in your life that you like to resolve. And there are those who approach conflict constructively. There are those who approach it destructively. And the two columns kind of help orient you to that. You know, sometimes it's good to agree on a time and place to talk things through. That's certainly what Euodia and Syntyche needed to do. And if we're destructive, you know, as the way we resolve things and the way we lead, we like to catch people off guard and unprepared. That's very destructive. Sometimes we need to honestly express our feelings. And when we're destructive, I think in our relationships, we suppress our feelings and we mumble and we grumble. And we've got all this internal stuff going on. When we're leading right, when we're a kingdom revolutionary, we learn to focus on problems, not people. Otherwise, we personalize disagreements and make it about us. Sometimes it's good to have someone come in alongside and say, you know what? We need another set of ears and eyes on this. Sometimes we think, well, I'll get my friends to referee this so they'll side with me. That's destructive. Sometimes developing a positive, mature attitude, that's always good. Being negative and vindictive, we ooze bitterness sometimes when we face these conflicts. Searching for a solution, it's always good. Finding someone to blame, that's not a kingdom revolutionary, is it? Focusing on specifics, definitely a good thing to do. Generalize and exaggerate, that's destructive. Being open and available, so good, it's so good. Being silent and superior, not good for the team. Affirming your responsibility, you know what, I'm not altogether sure I'm seeing it this way, but I understand I've got probably a part in this. Blaming somebody else, it's what everybody else does. We need something fresh and new and invigorating, right? What about when problems arise, working them out? And what about when problems arise, walking out? It's what everybody else does. Can we be fresher? Can we be newer? Can we be more invigorated? Can we be more of a kingdom revolutionary and handle it and live on the left side of the column? I think we can. And that's what Paul wants them to do. Listen, wait, and learn. Presume, assume, and dominate. Forgive. Stubbornly demand guarantees. You're going to do this, this, and this, and then we'll lift up Jesus. Huh? No. Kingdom revolutionaries, Yodia and Sentashi need to take a good hard look at the left side of that column. There's a bigger, better, revolutionary idea, and it's got to get proclaimed, but the only way we'll be effective at this is we've got to deal with this internal stuff that's festering inside. And that's not easy to do. This perhaps, and I'll tell you what, I'll throw this out on our Facebook page, church Facebook page. You can jump out there and reference it if you need to. This is the way we need to begin thinking about resolving conflict. You're on teams. You're in families. You work jobs. You're co-laborers with others in the community. You're in a church family. You're going to need this kind of thought, this renewing of the mind in this area of your life to see 2015 become a banner year. I'm not asking us not to have conflict in 2015. God only knows all the conflict we're going to face. What I'm asking, what I'm arguing and presenting this morning is that let's get the mind of Christ on it. And let's lift Him up in whatever conflicting situations we have. It's going to happen. But Paul says, hey, there's a better way. Well, you know what? I'm going to hasten on here. Verse 15, slide 3 quickly. We'll move this to a closing so that why do we want to handle conflict in a Christ-exalting way? Why is it that we want to not complain and grumble all the time on everything? Why is it? Because, again, kingdom revolutionaries are making a statement, and they're positioning their community of believers to do some great things in the community and the world. And he says, verse 15, so that you may become blameless, that is, transparent, and pure, unmixed and authentic, children of God. Notice the quotation here. He's quoting from the Old Testament, Deuteronomy. Children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. It's a phrase that Paul uses for people turning away from the Lord, finding other gods, and they're warped and they're crooked. And Paul says, let's not align with that. Let's not align with the right column, warped and crooked. Let's align with the left column, straight, narrow, harder, but wiser and better. Let's align with that. And let's keep Christ centered in our life. And then he says, you will shine among them like stars in the sky. And that's why I say this message really is about a revolution. It's about you and I doing things in such a way we honor the Lord and we lift up Christ. And in fact, the way we resolve conflict, again, is as healthy, emotionally healthy adults, by loving people well. It's one of the greatest gifts that you can give a community. And it's one of the greatest gifts that you can give a family. You know what? Honestly, as a pastor, people in the new community, the church, argue just as much as people outside of it. Honest, they do. The arguing is just probably the same. But what's not the same is when you have a Christ follower who has this incarnational demeanor of Jesus, and they begin to resolve conflict in a way, kind of the left column way, the way I've just talked to you about here. That is harder to find. And so we're not asserting that we don't argue like everybody else. We're not asserting that we're not warped and crooked, because sometimes we are warped and crooked in our thinking about things. But when we're blameless and pure, we come at this thing authentically and sincerely. We are dethroning our idols. We're not looking to other things. We're not looking to get our identity from other things. That we are bringing our whole heart to Christ. And we are not just in love with the gifts that God has given us in the world and making idols out of those and getting crooked and warped from this kind of idolatry. Instead, we are focused on the giver of the gifts. And we're focused on loving Him and honoring Him in every way. And so we love the gifts. We love the gift of sexuality, but we don't build a warped identity on that. We love the gift of recreation and sports, but we have a life apart from it. We love the beauty of creation, but we don't make trees equal to people, right? We love the adrenaline rush of new adventure or maybe a new season of life, but we also know how to do life in the reality of the everyday mundane. When there's no adrenaline rushes, it's just plodding, daily plodding. Is there joy in the daily plod? Is there joy in the daily give and take of everyday relationships? You see, we are revolutionaries, but we come at this in a way that Paul says, you will shine among them like stars in the sky. He says later here in verse 15. He wants the revolutionaries to shine. And how do we shine if we don't know how to resolve conflict? You know, I want to say to you today, some of you are you're in some pretty dark places. And I'm just going to share with you, the reason you have the job you have is God's calling you to shine there. And the reason you have the roommate you have is God's calling you to shine in that roommate arrangement. And the reason you're in the communities that you're a part of, and sometimes we chafe against those, and we want out of these just undesirable situations, who's going to be a light if you're not? Sometimes God calls us to shine in rehabilitation centers. Sometimes He calls us to shine on teams, wants us to shine in teams. God does this. And it's good because it's against the backdrop of a crooked and warped generation. You know, when we look at the overall backdrop of Rome, and we see what Paul was up against and what the revolution was up against in his day and time, we see a pretty perverse and crooked generation. Nero was the emperor at this time, and he was leading the Roman Empire. The depravity of Rome is well documented. They were warped and crooked. Their social lives, maybe even their holiday. We just come through a holiday. Their holiday celebrations were very unique and very guttural, very depraved. The baths, the theaters, the circuses, the orgiastic parties, the pagan temple restaurants. Rome was crooked and warped. It was messed up. And Paul understands this. They had the gladiatorial games. Condemned criminals or prisoners of war would kill each other before a yelling mob of fans, and they would hack and slash, and eventually the deaths were happening so quickly that it bored everybody, and so they invented armor to help the battles to last longer. Well, the Emperor Nero presided over all of this. Crooked, warped, perverse. In AD 54, he was a spoiled 16-year-old kid with all kinds of sexual deviancy. He was a harp player, an athlete, a Greek culture buff. He wanted to be deified as a god. And he was so thirsty for glory that he rigged music contests so that he would win them as he played his harp. And he rigged hunting contests and athletic contests so that he would finish first. So hungry for glory, so hungry for himself to lead in his own way, to be the savior of a Roman Empire. He thirsted for applause. He thirsted for notoriety. He loved showing off his skills and things. And he even had a private pleasure reserve built in the city, in the middle of the city. And so for evening entertainment, he had Christ followers dressed in the skins of wild animals. And he was entertained as dogs tore them apart. And Paul calls it a warped and crooked generation. He wanted to do some building projects in Rome. And flames erupted in some of the shops on July 18th, 64 AD. And through the use of gangs and thugs, no one was allowed to extinguish the flames. He wanted the city to burn because he had some ambitious construction projects that he wanted to accomplish. And so he blamed it eventually on the Christians setting the fire. And he interrogated these guys. He found out where other Christians were. He brought them into his little pleasure reserve in Rome. He made them into torches, and he burned them at night to illumine his gardens. Paul says, a warped and crooked generation. And in 68 A.D., Nero committed suicide when the empire revolted against him. You see, in a subversive kind of way, Paul says, I want us to hold out a light. Because we see it today. Christianity is slipping away. It's being driven to the margins here in America in so many ways. We are the new Rome. And it's slipping away. And Paul says, I got a vision. We've got to be revolutionaries in this time. We have to be. And you Philippians are our only hope. And I will say it to you this morning, you are the hope of the world. When you hold out a light such as this, that you do relationships differently, you do value systems differently, you have a biblical worldview, a Christ-centered worldview, this is what you're endeavoring to live by, it shines a bright light in a crooked and perverse, warped generation. And Paul is trying to help them capture a vision for that. And he's saying, whatever little petty differences you got in your body, it's not worth squelching or hindering or dimming the light that's going to shine through you. And so these little petty issues are not just little issues that don't mean anything. No, they mean a lot. Resolve them so that you can hold together and be a refreshing contrast to how the world does everything else, especially in your relationships. And so this morning, I hold out to you, and here the first Sunday in 2015, I hold out to you a calling, an exhortation to end a crooked and warped generation. It's time for a new revolution where a new generation decides to revolt in a way that honors our true King, the Savior of the world. It's time in His name that we revolt against idolatry, the idolatry of sex, wealth, and power. But we defend the beauty of God's good gifts and the enjoyment of them. It's time that we revolt against empty religion, but defend the rights of Christ's followers to live out their kingdom values, whether it's in the workplace or the military or as good citizens. It's time to revolt, a good kind of revolt, where we revolt against isolation, but we defend, whether it's a nation's right or another party's right to be independent and free. We revolt against unnecessary violence, especially against children who have no voice in the womb. We revolt against injustice and unjust wars, and we defend the weak who are being steamrolled by imperialistic regimes. We revolt against racism and prejudice, but we defend and we express gratitude to those who have died for us. We revolt against poverty and greed, but we defend the dignity of working hard and making a living. We revolt against abusing a creation, but we defend good stewardship of all of God's resources. We revolt against secularism, where we endeavor to live life without God, but we defend the pursuit of truth, no matter the institution or location. It's a plea this morning. I plead with Euodia. I plead with Syntyche. I plead with the congregation. It's time to be a revolutionary. And it starts in the little nitty-gritty area of life. As simple as resolving differences. David Crowder sings a song called Here's My Heart. Let's pull it up for a closing. And I just want to offer this as a closing today. Here's my heart. It's a new year. It's a new beginning. I think that there's a better way to begin a new year than just the way the world typically begins a new year. You know? I mean, hey, Pitbull has nothing over on the Apostle Paul. All right? Pitbull. Nah. Apostle Paul, revolutionary renewing of the mind, a new way to do life, I'm in. And you can be in too. You need a new life, a new way to do it. You ready? Okay, we're going to play this song. And if you want to offer your heart on the first Sunday of a new year, God, I'm ready.